The blizzard had come out of nowhere, transforming the Texas plains into a white hell that swallowed everything in its path. And Matthew Pierce knew he should have turned back an hour ago when the first flakes started falling. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and urged his horse forward through the mounting drifts. The animal whinnied nervously, its breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Matthew had been riding from San Antonio to Llano, carrying a message for the sheriff about cattle rustlers operating in the area, but now he wondered if he would even make it to the next town alive. The wind howled across the open landscape, carrying snow so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. That was when he spotted something dark against the white canvas of the ground. At first, he thought it might be a fallen log or a rock, but as he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. It was a person, curled on their side in the snow, dressed in buckskin clothing that was completely inadequate for this weather. Matthew dismounted immediately, nearly losing his footing in the deep snow. He rushed to the figure and dropped to his knees beside them. When he brushed the snow away from their face, he found himself looking at a young Apache woman, her lips already tinged blue with cold. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, dark and desperate. "Please help," she whispered, the words barely audible over the screaming wind. Matthew did not hesitate. "I will never leave," he said firmly, already shrugging out of his heavy coat to wrap around her shivering form. "I am getting you out of here." He lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she was, and managed to get her onto his horse. He climbed up behind her, holding her against his chest to share what little warmth he had left. The woman was unconscious now, her head lolling against his shoulder. Matthew could feel her shallow breathing against his neck. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and Matthew knew they would not survive if they tried to push through to Llano. He remembered passing an old line shack about a mile back, built by ranchers for use during cattle drives. It was their only chance. Fighting against the wind and snow, Matthew turned his horse around and headed in what he hoped was the right direction. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they moved through the white void. His hands were numb on the reins, and he could no longer feel his feet in the stirrups. The woman in his arms had stopped shivering, which he knew was a bad sign. When people stopped shivering, it meant their bodies were giving up the fight against the cold. "Stay with me," he said against her ear, though he was not sure she could hear him. "We are almost there. Just hold on a little longer." After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the dark shape of the line shack emerged from the blizzard. Matthew had never been so relieved to see anything in his life. He half fell from the saddle, still holding the woman, and kicked the door open. The shack was small, just one room with a fireplace and a few rough shelves, but it was shelter from the deadly wind. He laid the woman down on the floor as gently as he could and immediately set about building a fire. His fingers were so cold they barely worked, but he forced them to function. There was old kindling in a box by the fireplace, and someone had left a few logs stacked against the wall. Within minutes, he had flames crackling in the hearth. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman. Her lips were blue, her skin pale and cold to the touch. He needed to warm her up, and quickly. Matthew stripped off her wet buckskin dress, trying not to think about the impropriety of it, and wrapped her in the 2 wool blankets he found on a shelf. Then he removed his own wet outer clothes and lay down beside her, pulling her close to share his body heat. For a long time, they lay there by the fire while the storm raged outside. Matthew held the woman and prayed she would survive. He rubbed her arms and back, trying to encourage circulation. Gradually, very gradually, he felt warmth returning to her skin. Her breathing grew stronger and more regular. As the hours passed and the fire burned low, Matthew added more wood and checked on his unexpected companion. She was still unconscious, but her color was better. He found himself studying her face in the firelight. She was beautiful, with high cheekbones and thick black hair that fell past her shoulders. He wondered what she had been doing out in the storm alone, so far from any Apache settlement he knew of. Night fell, though it was hard to tell with the storm still howling outside. Matthew drifted in and out of sleep, always keeping one arm around the woman to monitor her condition. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, he woke to find her watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You saved me," she said softly. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked, suddenly acutely aware that they were lying very close together with very few clothes between them. He started to move away, but she caught his hand. "Stay, I am still cold." "What is your name?" he asked, settling back down beside her. Raven Hawk." "I am Matthew Pierce. What were you doing out in that storm, Raven?" Her expression darkened, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she said, "Running, from men who wanted to hurt me." Matthew felt anger kindle in his chest. "What men?" "White men. They attacked my camp 2 days ago, killed my brother and his wife. I ran, but they followed. I thought I had lost them when the storm came, but then I could not find shelter. I kept walking until I could not walk anymore." "I am sorry about your brother," Matthew said quietly. "Those men will not find you here. You are safe now." Raven looked at him searchingly. "Why did you help me? Most white men would have left me to die." "I am not most men," Matthew replied, "and no one deserves to freeze to death in the snow." They fell silent, listening to the wind outside. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Matthew added more wood to the fire and checked his supplies. He had some jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags, which he had brought inside when he went to check on his horse in the lean-to attached to the shack. It was not much, but it would keep them alive for a day or two. By morning, the storm had intensified further. Snow was piled against the door, and the wind rattled the shutters on the single window. Matthew shared his meager food with Raven, and they sat by the fire, not talking much but finding comfort in each other's presence. "How old are you?" Raven asked eventually. 26. "And you?" 22 summers. "I was married once, but my husband was killed in a raid 3 years ago." "I am sorry." She shrugged, though he could see the pain in her eyes. "That is the way of things. We loved each other, but love does not stop bullets." "No," Matthew agreed softly. "It does not." "Are you married?" Raven asked. "No, never found the right woman, I suppose, or maybe she has not found me yet." He smiled slightly. "I have been drifting for a while now, working as a ranch hand, sometimes as a scout or messenger. My parents died 5 years ago, and I have no siblings. No real ties to anywhere. That sounds lonely." "It is," Matthew admitted. He had never said that out loud before. "But it is easier than trying to put down roots and watching them get torn up again." Raven nodded slowly. "I understand that. After my husband died, I went to live with my brother. Now he is gone too. I do not know where I belong anymore." They spent the rest of that day talking, sharing stories of their lives. Matthew told her about growing up on a small ranch near Austin, about learning to rope and ride from his father, about his mother's gentle hands and kind smile. Raven spoke of her childhood in the mountains, of learning to track and hunt from her father, of the stories her grandmother told around the fire at night. As they talked, Matthew found himself increasingly drawn to this woman. She was intelligent and strong, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. There was a sadness in her eyes that matched something in his own soul, a recognition of loss and loneliness that created an unexpected bond between them. The storm continued for 3 full days. During that time, Matthew and Raven existed in a strange bubble of isolation from the rest of the world. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes and fears and dreams. They played simple games to pass the time, using pebbles and sticks. Matthew taught Raven how to play poker, and she taught him an Apache game involving counting and strategy. They took turns keeping the fire going and rationing their dwindling food supply. On the second night, as they lay side by side for warmth, Raven said, "Thank you for keeping your promise." "What promise? You said you would never leave. You kept your word." Matthew turned to look at her in the firelight. Her face was so close to his he could count her eyelashes. "I meant it. I do not break my promises." Something shifted between them in that moment. Raven reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Matthew caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Then, slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned in and kissed her lips. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but it quickly deepened into something more passionate. Matthew pulled Raven closer, and she responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I should not want this," Raven whispered. "Should not want you. Your people have brought mine so much pain." "I know," Matthew said. "And your people have reason to hate mine. But I am not asking you to forget that. I am just asking if maybe we can be something different, something new." Raven studied his face for a long moment, then kissed him again. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They made love by the firelight as the storm raged outside, finding warmth and connection and comfort in each other's arms. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together under the blankets, Matthew realized he was falling in love with this woman. It was crazy, impossible, and probably doomed to failure, but he could not help how he felt. In just 3 days, Raven had become more important to him than anything else in his life. "What will we do when the storm ends?" Raven asked quietly. "I do not know," Matthew admitted. "But I meant what I said. I will never leave you. If you want me, I am yours." "I want you," Raven said simply. "But it will not be easy. Your people will not accept us together. Then we will go somewhere they do not know us, start fresh." "Where?" Matthew thought about it. "California, maybe. I hear there are all kinds of people out there from everywhere. Maybe we could make a life there." "That is very far away." "Yes, but maybe that is what we need, a new place for a new beginning." Raven was quiet for a while, then said, "My people are scattered. The army has forced most of us onto reservations. I have no family left, no home to return to. Maybe going far away is the right choice." "We do not have to decide tonight," Matthew said, pulling her closer. "But whatever we decide together." On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Matthew woke to silence and realized the wind had stopped. He carefully extracted himself from Raven's arms and went to the door. When he pushed it open, he had to dig through 2 feet of snow, but eventually he cleared enough space to step outside. The world was transformed. Everything was buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The sky above was a brilliant blue, and the sun sparkled off the snow crystals like diamonds. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but Matthew knew it would be dangerous to travel until the snow started to melt. He checked on his horse, which had survived the storm in the lean-to. The animal was hungry and thirsty but otherwise fine. Matthew gathered snow to melt for water and gave the horse some of the hay stored in the lean-to. When he returned to the shack, Raven was awake and dressed. She had put her buckskin dress back on, though it was worn and patched. Matthew realized she had no other clothes, no possessions at all except what she wore. "We should stay here another day or 2, he said. "Let the snow melt enough to make travel safer. My supplies are almost gone, but I would rather be hungry than risk getting caught in another storm." Raven nodded. That is wise. And Matthew, last night I meant what I said. I want to be with you. Wherever you go, I will go too. Matthew crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. Then we will go to California, start a new life together. I do not have much money, but I am a hard worker. I will find a way to take care of us. I can work too, Raven said. I can hunt and track. I can sew and cook. We will make it work. They spent the next 2 days in the line shack, making plans for their future. Matthew calculated that it would take them weeks, possibly months, to reach California. They would need to stop in Llano first to get supplies, but then they could head west through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. On the 6th day after the storm, the snow had melted enough for them to travel. Matthew saddled his horse, and they set out for Llano. The journey that should have taken a few hours took all day because of the snow still on the ground, but by late afternoon, they could see the small town in the distance. As they rode down the main street of Llano, Matthew was acutely aware of the stares they received. A white cowboy traveling with an Apache woman was unusual enough to draw attention. He saw disapproval on some faces, curiosity on others, and outright hostility on a few. They stopped at the general store, and Matthew helped Raven dismount. Inside, the storekeeper looked them over with narrowed eyes but took Matthew's money readily enough. Matthew bought clothes for Raven, including a warm coat, as well as food and supplies for the journey ahead. "You are making a mistake, boy," the storekeeper said as he wrapped their purchases. "Apache squaw will bring you nothing but trouble." Matthew looked the man straight in the eye. "The lady is my future wife, and I will thank you to show her respect." The storekeeper snorted but said nothing more. Matthew gathered their supplies and led Raven back outside. They needed a place to stay for the night, but he suspected the hotel would not rent them a room. "There is a boarding house on the edge of town," said a voice behind them. Matthew turned to find an older woman with kind eyes watching them. "Mrs. Sullivan runs it. Tell her Alina sent you. She will not turn you away." "Thank you," Matthew said gratefully. Alina smiled. "You remind me of my son. He married a Comanche woman 20 years ago. They are happy together out in Arizona with 3 beautiful children." Do not let small-minded people discourage you. Her words gave Matthew hope. They found Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house, and after some initial hesitation, the widow agreed to rent them a room for the night. It was small but clean, with a comfortable bed and a wash basin. That evening, as they lay in the real bed, Raven said, "This is what it will be like, you know, people staring, people judging. Some will be cruel." "I know," Matthew said, "but some will be kind, like Alina and Mrs. Sullivan. We just have to find our place in the world. Build a life where we can be happy." "I am already happy," Raven said softly, "as long as I am with you." Matthew kissed her forehead. "Then we will be happy together." The next morning they prepared to leave Llano. Matthew had sent his message to the sheriff about the cattle rustlers, explaining that the storm had delayed him. Now there was nothing to keep them in this town. They would head west, toward a new life and new possibilities. As they rode out of Llano, Matthew looked back once at the small Texas town. He was leaving behind everything familiar, everything he had known. But when he looked at Raven riding beside him, he knew he was making the right choice. She was his future now, and he would do everything in his power to make sure they built a good life together. The journey to California was long and difficult. They traveled through Texas, stopping in small towns along the way to replenish their supplies. Sometimes people were hostile, but more often they were simply curious. Matthew and Raven kept to themselves, camping under the stars most nights and only staying in towns when absolutely necessary. As they traveled, their bond grew stronger. They learned each other's habits and quirks, their fears and dreams. Matthew taught Raven to read and write English, and she taught him Apache words and phrases. They shared the work of making camp and preparing meals. At night, they made love under the vast Texas sky, finding joy and comfort in each other's arms. One evening, as they sat by their campfire watching the sunset, Raven said, "I never thought I could feel this way again. After my first husband died, I believed that part of my life was over. But you have given me hope. You have made me believe in the future again." Matthew took her hand. "You have done the same for me. I was just drifting before I found you. Now I have a purpose, a reason to build something lasting." "Do you ever regret it?" Raven asked. "Giving up your old life for me?" "Never," Matthew said firmly. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." They crossed into New Mexico territory in late spring. The landscape changed from the flat plains of Texas to rocky mesas and desert scrubland. The weather grew warmer, and they saw fewer people the further west they traveled. In a small town called Las Cruces, they stopped to rest and resupply. Matthew found work for a few weeks as a ranch hand, earning money they would need for the rest of the journey. Raven worked alongside him when the rancher would allow it, proving herself as capable as any man with horses and cattle. The rancher, a gruff man named Tom Henderson, was skeptical at first about having an Apache woman working for him. But Raven quickly proved her worth, demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to calm even the most skittish horses. "She has got a gift," Tom admitted to Matthew one evening. "I have never seen anything like it. That Mustang we have been trying to break for weeks. She had him eating out of her hand in an hour." "She is special," Matthew agreed, watching Raven work with a young colt in the corral. The animal followed her around like a puppy, completely trusting. Tom was quiet for a moment, then said, "Look, I know it is not my business, but are you two married proper-like?" "Not yet," Matthew admitted. "We have not had the chance, but I intend to marry her as soon as we find a preacher willing to do it. There is a mission church about 10 miles south of here. Father Miguel, he is a good man. He does not care about things like that. He would probably marry you if you asked." Matthew felt hope bloom in his chest. "Really, really. Tell him I sent you. He will take care of you." The next day, Matthew and Raven rode to the mission. Father Miguel was indeed a kind man, with warm brown eyes and a gentle manner. He listened to their story without judgment, then smiled and said, "Love is a gift from God wherever it is found. I would be honored to join you in marriage." 3 days later, on a beautiful spring morning with the sun shining down on the adobe mission church, Matthew Pierce married Raven Hawk. They had no family present, no traditional trappings of a wedding, but it did not matter. When Matthew said his vows, promising to love and cherish Raven for the rest of his life, he meant every word. And when Raven promised the same, he could see the truth of it shining in her eyes. After the ceremony, Father Miguel gave them a marriage certificate and blessed them both. "Go with God," he said. "Build a good life together. Be happy." They returned to the ranch, and when they told Tom Henderson they were married, he insisted on throwing them a small celebration. Several of the ranch hands joined in, sharing food and drink and offering congratulations. It was not a grand wedding feast, but it was warm and genuine, and Matthew felt grateful for the acceptance they found here. After earning enough money, Matthew and Raven continued their journey west. They crossed into Arizona territory in early summer, traveling through stunning landscapes of red rock and towering cacti. The heat was intense, but they traveled mostly in the early morning and evening hours, resting during the hottest part of the day. In Arizona, they encountered more Apache people. Some were living on reservations, confined by the government to small parcels of land. Raven would watch these camps with sad eyes, and Matthew knew she was thinking of her lost family and the freedom her people had once known. One day they met an older Apache man traveling alone. He spoke with Raven in their language, and Matthew watched as emotions played across her face. When the man left, Raven was quiet for a long time. "What did he say?" Matthew asked gently. "He knew my father," Raven said. "He told me that my father is dead, killed last winter in a fight with soldiers who were trying to force his band onto the reservation." Matthew pulled his horse close to hers and took her hand. "I am so sorry." Tears streamed down Raven's face. "I am alone now. All my family is gone." "No," Matthew said firmly. "You are not alone. You have me. We are family now." Raven looked at him, her dark eyes swimming with tears. "I know, and I am grateful for that, but it still hurts." "Of course it does," Matthew said. He dismounted and helped her down from her horse, then held her while she cried for all she had lost. He could not take away her pain, but he could be there with her through it. They spent a few extra days camped in that spot, giving Raven time to grieve. Matthew hunted and fished and took care of camp, letting his wife process her emotions in her own time. Gradually, the sharp edge of her grief dulled into something more manageable, and she was ready to move on. As they continued west, they began to climb into higher elevations. The desert gave way to pine forests and cooler temperatures. They were getting close to California now, and Matthew could feel excitement building. They were almost to their destination, almost to the place where they could finally start building their new life. They crossed into California in late summer. The landscape was unlike anything Matthew had ever seen, with massive mountains and deep valleys. They made their way through the Sierra Nevada, taking their time on the treacherous mountain passes. Finally, they descended into the San Joaquin Valley, a vast expanse of fertile land stretching as far as the eye could see. This was where they would make their home, Matthew decided. This was where they would put down roots. They found a small town called Riverside, nestled along a creek with good water and surrounded by rolling hills. The town was young and growing, full of people from all over the world who had come to California seeking new opportunities. There were Mexican families, Chinese immigrants, former slaves who had come west after the war, and people from every corner of America and beyond. In this diverse community, Matthew and Raven's mixed marriage raised few eyebrows. They were welcomed cautiously at first, but as people got to know them, they found acceptance. Matthew found work with a local rancher who was building up his herd, and Raven sold beautiful buckskin goods she made, which were prized for their quality and craftsmanship. They rented a small house on the edge of town and began to build their life together. It was not easy at first. Money was tight and they worked long hours, but they were together, and that made everything worthwhile. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Raven said, "Do you remember that day in the snow when you found me?" "Of course," Matthew said. "That was the day my life changed." "Mine too," Raven said. "I thought I was going to die. I had given up, but then you came and you promised you would never leave. You kept that promise, Matthew. Through everything, you have kept it." "I always will," Matthew said, pulling her close. "You are my home now, Raven. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." A year after they arrived in Riverside, Raven discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Matthew with joy and terror in equal measure. He was going to be a father. He would have a family again, something he had not dared to dream of since his parents died. Raven bloomed during her pregnancy, growing more beautiful with each passing week despite her expanding belly. The women of Riverside took her under their wing, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Mrs. Chen, who ran the general store, taught Raven how to knit, and soon Raven was creating tiny blankets and booties for their coming child. Matthew worked harder than ever, taking on extra jobs to save money for the baby. He built a cradle with his own hands, carefully sanding and finishing the wood until it was smooth as silk. Every night, he would talk to Raven's belly, telling their unborn child stories and promises of the life they would have together. In early spring, Raven went into labor. Matthew paced outside their bedroom while Mrs. Chen and two other women attended to his wife. He could hear Raven's cries of pain, and it took everything in him not to burst into the room. He felt helpless, unable to do anything to ease her suffering. After what felt like an eternity, he heard a different cry, a baby's cry. Mrs. Chen opened the door, her face beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Pierce, a healthy, strong boy." Matthew rushed into the room and found Raven propped up in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of black hair and was waving tiny fists in the air, already protesting the indignity of being born. "He is perfect," Matthew whispered, touching one tiny hand with his finger. The baby's fingers closed around his, and Matthew felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Raven asked. They had discussed names during her pregnancy but had not decided definitively. Now, looking at his son, Matthew knew. Thomas. After the man who helped us in New Mexico. Thomas Pierce. Raven smiled. "Thomas, I like that. Thomas Pierce." Being a father changed Matthew in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself thinking constantly about the future, about what kind of world his son would grow up in. He wanted to give Thomas every opportunity, every chance to build a good life. When Thomas was 6 months old, Matthew made a decision. He went to the bank and asked about buying land. The banker, a shrewd man named Mr. Foster, looked over Matthew's modest savings and shook his head. "You do not have enough for good farmland, but there is a piece of property on the edge of town that might work. 20 acres, mostly scrubland, but there is a creek running through it. It is cheap because it needs a lot of work." Matthew went to look at the property and immediately saw its potential. The land was rough, but with hard work, it could be turned into something productive. The creek meant they would have water year-round, which was invaluable in California. He bought the land with nearly all their savings, knowing he was taking a gamble but believing it was the right choice. For the next 2 years, Matthew worked tirelessly to develop their land. He built a house, larger and sturdier than the one they had been renting. He cleared fields and planted crops. He built corrals and bought a few cattle. Raven worked beside him whenever she could, with Thomas strapped to her back or playing nearby. The work was back-breaking and exhausting. There were times when Matthew wondered if he had made a mistake, if they would have been better off staying in town. But slowly, gradually, the land began to produce. Their crops grew. Their cattle multiplied. They started to make a profit. By the time Thomas was 3 years old, the Pierce Ranch was well established. They had 20 head of cattle, fields of wheat and vegetables, and a reputation for quality livestock. Matthew had also started breeding horses, using Raven's expertise with the animals to produce calm, well-trained mounts that were in high demand. Life was good, but it was not always easy. They faced challenges regularly. One year, a drought nearly destroyed their crops. Another year, rustlers stole half their cattle. But through every difficulty, Matthew and Raven faced it together, their bond growing stronger with each shared trial. When Thomas was 4, Raven became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder on her. She was tired all the time and sick for months. Matthew worried constantly, but Raven assured him she was fine. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said. "I am strong. We will be fine." She was right. After another long labor, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Sarah, after Matthew's mother. Sarah had her father's light brown hair and her mother's dark eyes, a perfect blend of both parents. With 2 young children, the ranch became even more challenging to manage. But they adapted, finding new rhythms and routines. Thomas proved to be a curious, energetic child who followed his father everywhere, eager to help with any task. Sarah was quieter but equally determined, watching everything with her serious dark eyes. As the children grew, Matthew and Raven made sure they understood both sides of their heritage. They taught them English and Apache. They shared stories from both cultures. Matthew wanted his children to be proud of who they were, to never feel shame about their mixed blood. The town of Riverside grew around them. More families moved in, more businesses opened. The Pierce Ranch became an integral part of the community. Matthew was known as a fair dealer and a hard worker. Raven was respected for her skills and her quiet dignity. Their children were accepted by most of the other children in town, though there were occasional incidents of name-calling or exclusion. The first time Thomas came home crying because another boy had called him a half-breed, Matthew's blood boiled. He wanted to march over to the other family's house and give them a piece of his mind, but Raven stopped him. "This will not be the last time," she said quietly. "We cannot fight every battle for them. We have to teach them to be strong, to be proud of who they are." She was right, of course. So instead of confronting the other family, Matthew and Raven sat down with their children and talked to them about prejudice, about ignorance, about finding strength in their heritage rather than shame. Years passed. Thomas grew into a tall, strong young man who could ride and rope as well as any cowboy. Sarah became a skilled horsewoman and an excellent seamstress. Both children were smart and capable, and Matthew was immensely proud of them. When Thomas was 18 and Sarah was 14, tragedy struck. A fever swept through the valley, killing dozens of people. Sarah fell ill, burning up with fever that would not break. Matthew and Raven took turns sitting with her, bathing her with cool water, praying for her recovery. For 3 days, Sarah hovered between life and death. Matthew felt like he was living through a nightmare. He could not lose his daughter. He could not bear it. He bargained with God, offering anything if Sarah would just survive. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Sarah's eyes fluttered open and she whispered, "Papa." Matthew burst into tears, holding his daughter's hand. "I am here, sweetheart. You are going to be all right." Sarah's recovery was slow but steady. It took weeks before she was back to her normal self, but she survived. Matthew felt like he had been given a gift, a second chance with his daughter. He vowed never to take a single day with his family for granted. As his children approached adulthood, Matthew found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It had been nearly 20 years since that winter day when he found Raven freezing in the snow. 20 years since he made a promise to never leave. He had kept that promise, through good times and bad, through challenges and triumphs, and he would keep it for the rest of his life. One evening, as he and Raven sat on their porch watching the sunset, he said, "Do you ever miss it?" "Your old life before me." Raven was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sometimes I miss my family. I miss the way things were when I was young, before everything changed. But I do not miss my life before you. You gave me a new life, a better life. You gave me children and a home and love. I would not trade that for anything." "I love you," Matthew said, taking her hand. "I have loved you since that lined shack when we were trapped by the storm. I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Raven said. "You kept your promise. You never left." Thomas announced his intention to marry when he was 20. The girl was named Emily, the daughter of a local farmer, and she was sweet and kind and clearly adored Thomas. Matthew gave his blessing, and they were married in a small ceremony at the church in Riverside. A year later, Thomas and Emily had their first child, a boy they named Matthew, after his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, Matthew Pierce felt his eyes fill with tears. This child was the future, the continuation of the family he and Raven had built together against all odds. Sarah married when she was 19, to a young rancher named Jacob Morris who treated her like a queen. They built a house on the adjoining property and raised cattle. Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, when she was 21, and Matthew found himself a grandfather twice over in the same day. As Matthew approached 50, he began to slow down. Years of hard physical labor had taken their toll on his body. He had aches and pains that never quite went away, but he had no regrets. He had built a good life, raised good children, and loved a good woman. Raven aged more gracefully than Matthew, her beauty evolving but never fading. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her dark eyes were still as sharp and intelligent as they had been the day he met her. She was the center of their family, the heart that kept everything together. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Matthew arranged a surprise for Raven. He took her back to New Mexico, to the mission where Father Miguel had married them. The old priest was still alive, though bent with age now. He remembered them and blessed them again, celebrating their enduring love. Standing in that small adobe church, Matthew held Raven's hands and looked into her eyes. 25 years ago, I promised to love you for the rest of my life. Today, I renew that promise. You are my everything, Raven. My love, my partner, my best friend. Thank you for sharing your life with me. Tears streamed down Raven's face. And thank you for saving mine, for keeping your promise, for never leaving. I love you, Matthew Pierce. I will love you forever. They returned to Riverside and their ranch, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. The Pierce Ranch had become one of the most successful in the area, known for quality livestock and fair dealing. Thomas had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, allowing Matthew to step back and enjoy his grandchildren. Matthew spent his days teaching the grandchildren to ride and rope, sharing stories of the old days. He told them about finding their grandmother in the snow, about the promise he made and how he kept it. He told them about the long journey to California, about building the ranch from nothing. He wanted them to understand where they came from, to appreciate the sacrifices that had been made. Raven spent her time with the grandchildren too, teaching them Apache words and stories, making sure they knew that side of their heritage. She taught the girls to sew and the boys to track. She shared her knowledge freely, wanting to pass on everything she had learned. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Matthew said, "We did it, you know. We built something good here, something lasting." "Yes," Raven agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We did, and it all started with a promise." "A promise I am glad I made," Matthew said. "I will never leave," I said, "and I never have, I never will." The years continued to pass. Matthew and Raven grew older, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They celebrated 30 years of marriage, then 35, then 40. They watched their grandchildren grow up and start families of their own, giving them great-grandchildren to spoil and adore. When Matthew was 68, he suffered a fall from a horse that left him badly injured. He spent weeks in bed, Raven by his side constantly. The doctor said he might never walk properly again. But Matthew was stubborn, and with Raven's encouragement and support, he slowly regained his strength. He would always walk with a limp after that, but he walked. Raven's health remained good well into her 60s. She was still active, still working in her garden and with the horses. But when she was 67, she began to slow down. She tired easily and sometimes seemed confused. Matthew noticed and worried but said nothing, not wanting to alarm her. One morning when Matthew was 70, he woke to find Raven watching him with tears in her eyes. "What is wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "I am scared," she admitted. "I can feel myself fading. My mind is not as sharp as it was. My body does not work the way it should. I am scared of leaving you." Matthew pulled her close, his own eyes filling with tears. "I am scared too, but we have had a good life, Raven, a wonderful life. Whatever time we have left, we will face it together." "You promised you would never leave," Raven said. "And I have not," Matthew replied. "I am still here. I will always be here." They held each other as the sun rose, two people who had loved each other for over 40 years, still finding comfort in each other's arms. Raven's decline was gradual but steady. She began to forget things, to get confused about where she was or what year it was. But she always remembered Matthew. Even on her worst days, when she could not remember her own children's names, she knew him. She would look at him and smile and say, "You are the man who saved me, the man who promised never to leave." Matthew took care of her with patience and love. He helped her dress in the morning and brushed her hair. He made sure she ate and took her for walks around the property she loved so much. Their children and grandchildren helped when they could, but mostly it was Matthew, keeping the promise he had made so many years ago. One spring morning, when the wildflowers were blooming and the air was sweet with the scent of new growth, Raven did not wake up. She passed peacefully in her sleep with Matthew holding her hand. She was 69 years old. Matthew was devastated. For days he could barely function. His children worried about him, afraid he would not recover from the loss. But slowly, with the support of his family and his faith, Matthew began to heal. He would never stop missing Raven, never stop loving her, but he could go on. He found comfort in his memories, in the stories he could share with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He told them about the beautiful Apache woman he had found in the snow, about the promise that had changed both their lives. He made sure they understood that love could transcend any barrier, any prejudice, any obstacle, if it was strong enough and true enough. Matthew lived for another 8 years after Raven's death. He spent that time surrounded by the family they had built together. He watched great-grandchildren be born and grow. He saw the ranch continue to prosper under Thomas's management. He took joy in small things: a beautiful sunset, a grandchild's laugh, a perfect spring day. When Matthew Pierce died at the age of 78, he was surrounded by 3 generations of family. His last words were, "I kept my promise, I never left." And then he closed his eyes and went to join Raven, the love of his life, wherever she was waiting for him. The Pierce family continued to grow and prosper in California. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to the love and hard work of the man and woman who had founded it. Their story was passed down through the years, becoming family legend. The tale of a cowboy who found a freezing Apache woman alone in the snow, who heard her plea for help and promised never to leave, and who kept that promise for the rest of his life. In the small cemetery outside Riverside, 2 headstones stand side by side. One reads, "Matthew Pierce, 1845–1923, beloved husband, father, and grandfather." The other, "Raven Hawk Pierce, 1849–1920, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother," and beneath both inscriptions the same words, "Together forever." Their love story had begun in a blizzard, with a desperate plea and a solemn promise. It had weathered prejudice and hardship, loss and pain. But it had endured, strong and true, a beacon of hope showing that love could indeed conquer all, that two people from different worlds could build a life together, that a promise made in the darkest moment could light the way to a beautiful future. The legacy they left behind was not just the successful ranch or the large family, though those were significant. Their real legacy was the example they set, of loyalty, of courage, of love that transcended boundaries. They showed their children and grandchildren that what matters is not where you come from or what others think, but how you treat the people you love and whether you keep your promises. In the years that followed Matthew's death, the story of his and Raven's meeting became somewhat romanticized, taking on almost mythical qualities. But those who had known them personally, who had seen their daily devotion to each other, knew that the reality was even more beautiful than the legend. They had loved each other with a steady, enduring love that had sustained them through 5 decades of life together. Thomas Pierce, their eldest son, lived to be 92 years old. He often spoke of his parents, keeping their memory alive for new generations. He would tell anyone who would listen about how his father had found his mother dying in the snow and promised never to leave her, a promise kept until the very end. Sarah Morris also lived a long life, dying at 87. She wrote down many of her mother's stories and songs, preserving that Apache heritage for future generations. She made sure her children and grandchildren knew where they came from, understood both sides of their family history. The Pierce Ranch remained successful for many decades, though eventually it was sold out of the family as descendants moved to cities or pursued other careers. But the house Matthew built with his own hands still stood, a California historical landmark now, with a plaque telling the story of the family who had lived there. Visitors to the site can still see the original homestead, can walk the land Matthew and Raven worked so hard to develop. They can see the creek where the children played, the porch where Matthew and Raven sat together every evening, watching the sun set over the California hills. They can visit the small cemetery and see those 2 headstones, side by side, together forever. The story of Matthew Pierce and Raven Hawk has been told and retold over the years, inspiring countless people. It is a story about more than just romantic love, though there is plenty of that. It is a story about commitment, about keeping promises even when it is difficult. It is about choosing love over prejudice, hope over despair, together over alone. It is a story that shows that sometimes the most important decisions in life are made in a single moment. Matthew could have ridden past that figure in the snow, could have told himself it was not his problem. Raven could have given up hope, could have closed her eyes and let the cold take her. But neither of them did. They both chose differently, and that choice changed everything. From that single moment, a whole life grew. A marriage that lasted 46 years, 2 children, multiple grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a successful ranch, a legacy of love and commitment that inspired generations. All because a cowboy found a freezing Apache woman alone in a blizzard because she asked for help and he promised never to leave. It is a reminder that we never know how our choices will ripple out into the future. That single act of compassion, that promise made in a moment of crisis, created a family legacy that lasted over a century. The descendants of Matthew and Raven Pierce, scattered now across California and beyond, all trace their existence back to that winter day in 1871, when love began in the most unlikely circumstances. The story also serves as a testament to the resilience of love. Matthew and Raven faced enormous challenges, cultural differences, societal prejudice, economic hardship, the normal struggles of life and aging. But their love survived all of it. They chose each other every day through good times and bad. That kind of commitment, that kind of devotion, is rare and precious. In the end, what Matthew and Raven proved is that love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about showing up every day. It is about keeping promises. It is about choosing your partner over and over again, through decades of ordinary life. It is about building something together, brick by brick, day by day, until you look back and realize you have created something beautiful and lasting. Their story reminds us that the wildest love stories are not found in fairy tales but in real life, in the choices real people make when faced with difficult circumstances. Matthew was not a prince and Raven was not a princess. They were ordinary people who found each other in extraordinary circumstances and chose to build an extraordinary life together. The cowboy who found a freezing Apache woman alone in the snow kept his promise. He never left. And in keeping that promise, he found a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy that would endure long after both he and Raven were gone. Their love story, born in a blizzard and sustained through 5 decades of marriage, stands as proof that true love, committed love, promise-keeping love, is the most powerful force in the world.